Hi, this is Sean Perrin, and you're listening to episode 26 of the Clarineat podcast. Today's guest is Francois Houle. This episode is brought to you by D'Addario Woodwinds. Sanding, shaping, balancing. For centuries, mastering your instrument meant mastering these crafts too. But now, D'Addario is redefining craftsmanship for the 21st century by refining their reeds and mouthpieces with technology built from the ground up. By using the world's most innovative techniques to deliver consistently what was once made variable by hand, D'Addario ensures excellence right out of the box as standard, not a surprise. So you can spend less time sanding, shaping, and balancing, and more time perfecting your own craft. To learn more about the new era of craftsmanship from D'Addario Woodwinds, visit d'addario.com/woodwinds. Clarinetist François Houle has established himself as one of today's most inventive musicians in all of the diverse musical spheres he embraces. Inspired by collaborations with the world's top musical innovators, Francois has developed a unique improvisational language, virtuosic and rich with sonic embellishment and technical extensions. A sought-after soloist and chamber musician, he has actively expanded the clarinet's repertoire by commissioning some of today's leading Canadian and international composers and premiering over 100 new works. A founding member of critically acclaimed ensembles such as Sea and Sky, the Turning Point Ensemble, and Standing Wave, Francois has also collaborated with leading ensembles in Canada, including ECM+, Bozzini Quartet, Fibonacci Trio, among others. He has been listed on numerous occasions in Downbeat magazine's readers' and critics' polls as a talent deserving wider recognition and a rising star. We discuss in this episode mostly Francois' CD releases. He has 3 that we sort of focus on a little bit, and sort of his concept of finding his own musical voice and how he became to be so diverse and so successful at that diversity, which is in itself a challenge. The giveaway for today's episode is several signed copies of Francois' CDs. If you'd like to be eligible to win items mentioned on the podcast, be sure to go to www.clarinet.com/giveaways. Before we get started today with the episode, I'd like to play an excerpt from Francois' CD called Aerials. Now, this CD, he actually used the clarinet and sort of combined it with the reverb sounds from the piano to a really, really interesting effect, which I think that you're just going to love. Hi, Francois, and welcome to the Clarinet podcast. Thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Sean.
So you're an extremely versatile player who has played virtually every style of music ranging from avant-garde to classical, jazz, even pop music. Before we get started with all the amazing things that you've done, how does one work towards becoming so versatile as a player?
I think you have to start by having a nervous breakdown after graduating from university and wondering what the hell you're going to do with your life, you know. Actually, interestingly enough, when I graduated, I ended up going to the Banff Center for the Arts for the winter cycle, they used to call it, which is an extended 5-6 month residency that would start in late September and go until the spring. And this was like, we're talking 1987. That was after I graduated from Yale University. So I had a master's degree in my pocket, and I just wanted to buy some time to prepare for auditions, basically, which was what everybody did.
For orchestral auditions?
For orchestral auditions, yeah. So I met a bunch of players from the Calgary Phil when I was in Banff, and I was hired to play utility clarinet for a couple of concerts, and that worked out pretty good. But musically speaking, it was fun. It was like we did American in Paris and Rhapsody in Blue, and I can't remember who the soloist was, but after the music was fine, but after the experience, I I sort of it raised a lot of sort of red flags as to am I the right fit, the right personality to aim at getting a career in orchestral playing. And I looked at the options and I talked to a lot of people, you know, teachers, clarinetist colleagues, whatever. And I quickly realized that, you know, if I didn't want to do orchestral playing, it wouldn't mean that I was a failure or anything, that there were so many other avenues possible. One person that I met that really challenged that sort of almost a North American notion that to be a good clarinet player, you got to get an orchestra job. It was Alan Hacker, a British clarinet player, who actually came to Banff to give me some coaching and stuff like that, because they used to have guest lecturers, guest artists coming into the Banff Center program. And so I got to work with him for a couple of weeks. And after a couple of weeks, you know, we talked about everything from improvisation to chamber music to playing concertos, you name it. We touched the subject, you know. And he said something to me that really got me thinking very differently about my career or my plans for a career. And he said, you know, your playing is very poetic, and it doesn't sound, you don't sound like, you know, the 99% of the clarinet players who are going to get work in orchestras. You've got something else to say. So it was not about technique. It was not about, you know, artistic affinities or anything like that. It was just about the sound and about this personal voice that we all aim at developing, especially outside of the classical arena. When you talk to jazz musicians, they always say you got to develop your own voice, you know, your individuality. And of course, when you want to get a orchestra job, you don't think about your personal voice and your identity, your musical identity. You just want to fit into the section and serve the section the best you can. And the section is always looking for a certain profile in clarinet players. And if you don't fit that profile 100%, you're not going to win an audition and you're not going to do well. So I was in that 1% of players that were like, okay, my teachers always complained about my tone. I would play a phrase and I would change my tone throughout the phrase. And I remember Keith Wilson at Yale University, Yale School of Music, saying, why do you do that, Frankie? He used to call me Frankie. And I would say, well, that's how I feel it. And it was like, well, that's not good enough. That's not going to work. You know, like you got to play it this way or it's not going to work. And I was like, the hell with that. I'm going to play it the way I want.
Yeah.
So I was a bad student, but I was parked in the right place because, you know, Keith Wilson he was Richard Stolzman's clarinet teacher, principal clarinet teacher for a while after he studied with Leary. And after a little while of discussing and arguing and butting heads, he sort of realized that that my areas of interest in the music was a little bit more eclectic than what he was accustomed to. And he said, you know, like maybe you should consider working more on jazz, on improvisation. He even set up a way for me to meet with Benny Goodman to fire me up to look at that stuff. And so you can
Sorry,
see
did you
already,
say you met Benny Goodman?
Yeah. When we were at Yale, Benny Goodman came to do a fundraiser for Yale School of Music with his orchestra, played at Woolsey Hall, and I was in charge of moving his stool around for him and making sure he got his scotch and that it wasn't disturbed during the break in the concert. And you know, he was an old guy. He was pretty grumpy. I don't think he was, you know, feeling too good. But he did this thing. He was a consummate professional. But you know, we got to chat, and it was just an amazing experience just to meet the guy and you know, see how he carried himself on stage and behind the stage. And you know, when he talked to the students, he was very generous at the time, considering that he, you know, I think he died like a few months after that. And but anyway, you know, like meeting him working with Keith, and Richard Stolzman came to Yale as well to give a master class, David Schifrin. Met a lot of players, and very often that was the comment that they had to make about my playing. It was like, well, you're not American school, you're not French school, you're sort of fitting in between in the cracks, so to speak. And I was interested always in repertoire that was sort of off the beaten path. At the time, I was maybe a little bit more of a renegade than I am now, and that might sound a bit ironic, but it's true. Because now in when I'm doing so much classical music right now, and a lot of repertoire that I thought I would never get to play again, like Mozart Quintet, and I played the Weber Concertino just last January. That's a piece that I never thought I would ever touch again after I graduated from school,
Yeah.
But here I am playing this music and then collaborating with, pretty hardcore improvisers and working with Dan Manigan's collaborators, with Gord Gardina, Kenton Vaughan, it's all over the map. But anyway, there was some early signs to answer your question. I'm giving you the long story here.
That's okay.
It was definitely a predisposition or a way that I heard things, When I started on the clarinet, I started really young. I was like about 7 years old when I picked up my first clarinet. And I remember making this first sound, and my parents were saying, "Oh, we've got all these LPs of great clarinet players. You should check those out." So I started listening to these things, and my dad would always play music on Sunday mornings after we coming back from church and whatnot. And but his collection was like he had like 4 LPs, and it was like 2 LPs by Benny Goodman, an Artie Shaw CD, and a Woody Herman CD LP. No CDs at the time.
Yeah.
And this was the late '60s, right? So the first clarinet sounds that I had in my ear was Benny Goodman and Artie Shaw and Woody Herman, and then of course when I started lessons and everything, my teacher turned me on to Marcellus with Cleveland Orchestra and things like that. So, but I already had a quite eclectic diet of clarinet sounds in my head from the get-go, and I think that probably subconsciously marked me because I was always experimenting with mouthpieces, with reeds, with different clarinets. I even played a metal clarinet for a little while. I had some really beat up Selmer 9s, some centered tones. I switched to buffet, and I tried everything, So I was never really an R13 guy from the get-go, and this is the type of sound you play, and this is the kind of mouthpiece you play. I've always been looking for different sounds, different ways of playing the instrument.
So when I was talking with Ed Jaffe a while ago, he mentioned that modern musicians kind of need to be musical chameleons to be successful. Do you feel that way too, or do you feel this is just sort of where you fit in?
Well, despite the fact that I tried to do a lot of different things, the focus is still the instrument, and I try to find a way of approaching the instrument where I'm comfortable, where I feel like it's a good fit, and I'll part that attitude into the music. If I feel that the music is worth exploring, worth playing, I get a good feeling out of it. I just go with my instinct.
How do you tell if a piece is really worth playing? I mean, I talked to Harry Sparnai the other day, and he said from the moment he opens the score, he just knows if he'll touch a piece again.
Yeah, usually, yeah, it's first impression is very important. But again, I've revisited repertoire that I never thought I'd do again, or pieces that I looked at the score and I thought, I'll never play this. Boulez's Domaine, for example. I looked at that piece of music, glanced through it very quickly when I was a student in university, and I thought, no, it's not my thing. And I went back to look at it and then looked at his newer material, the Dialogue de l'Ombre Double, and I ended up recording and performing this material. So you never know. what guides me the most is the feeling that I get and the level of satisfaction that I get out of playing something. And if it's there, if I draw pleasure out of it, of course I will put my whole into it and develop it. You know. But I think your question had a bit more to do with career decisions more than repertoire.
Oh yeah, we just sort of sidetracked. Sorry.
That's okay. I was going to bring it back to that because it's a good question. I mean, what happened was that when I graduated, of course, and I had to, after I went to Banff, I got a grant to go and do some research on historical instruments in Europe. And it was my first time in Europe. I had a plan to go to all the different instrument collections and meet players and instrument makers. And I went to Buffet and I went to Selmer with a list of questions. And I was a bit of an idealistic student, you know, in a way that I thought, oh, I'm going to write a book on the history of clarinet and blah, blah, blah. Then I realized that Philip T. Young had already done all the research, and a number of people have already written the stories and everything. So, but what I learned from it was that I met, you know, the sort of the clarinet, the front line of the clarinet world, you know, so all the well-known brand names, the well-known players. But what I didn't know was that there was this whole other undercurrent of players that were sort of like almost counterculture to this sort of clarinet.org scene, you know?
Yeah.
And Harry Sparney was one of them, actually. That's interesting that you've spoken to him, because he's a guy who went and took a totally different path. And
oh, yeah, he invented the path.
Well, pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
And, you know, and paved the way for so many other players. But I met people like that most people on the classical side will have never heard of, like people like Ab Bars, Michael Moore, Louis Clavis, who's probably the more known of the three that I just mentioned, Tony Coe, who is well known as a sax player. He's the guy who recorded the saxophone solo for the Pink Panther, for example. Well, Tony Coe is a good friend of Alan Hacker, and they even recorded and commissioned pieces together, clarinet duos, and he was a fantastic clarinet player. And in London, when you talk about Tony Coe, he's known as a clarinet player, as a jazz clarinet player.
Mm-hmm.
So these guys they were all those names I mentioned, they're all improvisers, and they compose as well, and they play their own music. They don't really play other people's music except when they're collaborating in various groups. And I didn't know that was possible at the time. You know, I just thought, wow, what if I went back home and started writing my own music and started learning how to improvise properly and interact with people on the jazz scene, but also on the free improv scene, you know.
It's interesting to hear you say that, because Evan Zaporin kind of said the same thing. He said that he was having trouble finding people to play his music, but he could get people to have him play his music.
Oh,
and
yeah.
It turned out better for him too, and it just really spiraled from there into something great.
Exactly. And you know, Evan has got his own parkour, so to speak. And I when I came here, when I moved to Vancouver, it was more it was like literally a New Year's Eve 1990. And the idea was to get a fresh start, to just put the school years behind, put the artistic residencies behind, and just start officially, you know, on my own path. And I stumbled upon a really rich and fertile improvised music scene in Vancouver, and it's sort of like a new music scene that was very that was where the aesthetics considerations were very different than where I came from, you know, in Montreal and living in New York and Connecticut. So I really, that was my diet when I was here. I hardly ever went to classical concerts. I just checked out the improv music scene, the jazz scene, and started collaborating with some of these people. But also met a number of people who were interested in contemporary music. There was a few festivals being put together with the Vancouver New Music Society, VNNS at the time. Now it's just called Vancouver New Music, and Pro Musica Society, which was as opposed to the Montreal Pro Musica, it was a real new music society here that foster the development of new composers, basically, students and young emerging composers. So I got involved in that, and out of Pro Musica, there was a group that was formed called Standing Wave that I was asked to join, and it was me on clarinet, Peggy Lee on cello, Laurie Lister on percussion, and Lei Tuan on piano. So it was sort of like a hybrid group of instruments. It was not pure ensemble, it was not quartet for the end of time ensemble. It was a hybrid. That was done on purpose so that we could develop our own repertoire. And I was a member of Standing Wave for like 11 years and played over 1,000 compositions with that group. And long enough to develop a really strong aversion to to playing poorly written or music by composers who were maybe not ready for the rigors of that world,
Yeah.
But also learned how to teach and learn how to learn, through that process, and learning how to recognize talent also, and to recognize people who have a good combination of talent and skills to be able to put forth their vision, their musical vision. So after 11 years of doing that, I would say that I've given a good, kick at the bucket, so to speak, in terms of new music. But it's made me a sort of a specialist of that scene.
Yeah, absolutely.
But what was interesting was that the more we developed as a group and the more we collaborated with composers, we realized that there was a need for the composers to interact more with the performers, to learn about, instrument, how to write for the instruments, the instrumental practice, new practices like extended techniques, but also to learn about the attitude of the performer towards the written score and how to make it effective. The score is just a medium between, it's a means of communicating ideas between, a composer who jots down his ideas and a performer who has to interpret these ideas.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a bit of a divide there that it's a buffer zone that gives license to the performers and the composers to do whatever the hell they want to do.
Yeah.
and it's confrontational from that point on. It's like the composers will say, "I want you to do it this way. This is the sound that I want." And there was no real dialogue going on for a long time between composers and performers, for the performers to say to a composer, "Well, I can do it this way, but there is a better way, and it will sound better in this context. Let me try it." And then we would try some things and experiment with composers, and it became a very healthy thing. So if there was one great positive thing that came out of all those years of playing new music, not just here, but anywhere, I've collaborated with Lanzin, I collaborated with SAM in Montreal, et cetera, is that my rapport with the composers is almost the same now as my rapport with an improviser.
Oh, wow.
Which is, I can walk up to a composer and say, "Hey, I like your ideas. I like the sound you're getting. And how did you do this? How did you come up with this idea?" I'll ask a bunch of questions. And then they'll turn around and go, "How do you do this? How can I write this better for the clarinet?" And like I said, it's a healthy dialogue that promotes creativity, as opposed to supporting, things, or supporting a sort of status quo of a very divided practice of being a composer and being a performer.
Absolutely. So that's a lot of great stuff about your upbringing and your time in Vancouver and working with composers, the dialogue that starts. That's all that all often culminates into a recording of which you've done many. Can we briefly touch on your three records, Rue Paul Fort Paris, and then Double Entendre,
Hmm.
and also Aerials? Just real quick, each one. They're each kind of interesting in
Yeah,
their own way.
sure, sure. I mean, they're completely different.
Yeah.
Rue Paul Fort, that's sort of well, here, I'll try to make a short story from a long story. Um, I've, I believe in long-term collaborations, you know, and on that CD, it's a trio CD with French pianist Benoit Delbecq and French bassist Joël Léon, so a couple of French musicians that I've had the good fortune of meeting in Vancouver in the context of the Vancouver International Jazz Festival.
Hmm.
And what's I met Benoit in '94. I met Joël in '93 or '92. And when I first met Joël, I mean, I've never heard, first of all, an improviser like her. She plays double bass, right?
Hmm.
I mean, and then when I figured out about her story and her upbringing and her lifelong development of bass techniques and bass repertoire, um, I mean, she's a legend in the improvised music world and in the new music world. But if you talk to most classical players in orchestras, they don't know who Joël Léon is. She was the first woman to graduate from the Paris Conservatory in double bass. And her first gig when she graduated was to play with Ensemble Intercontemporain with Pierre Boulez.
Wow.
So she's not a flake. She's not faking it. She's the real deal. And she's got French technique, French bowing technique, and plays a Bohemian bass. So it's a smaller bass than the orchestral setup that most people use. And she's just a if you know the word virtuoso is used very gratuitously these days, but if you could apply it to one person, she would be the one. And I've played with great players. I've met and worked with Edgar Meyer, with Gary Carr, and people like that. And Joel is heads and shoulders above and beyond those people, technically and musically. I can tell you that
Hmm.
sincerely, and it's not because she's my friend.
Yeah.
She really is a phenomenon, um, and she's a very real militant advocate of new music and improvisation. And what's interesting with Joel, and this is the short story, by the way. I could give you the long version, but even the short version has to be a bit long because it's so fascinating. Um, After she graduated and worked professionally in Paris for a few years, she got a grant to go to SUNY Buffalo to work with John Cage.
Oh wow.
She was at a festival there, and she went and studied with John Cage, and she met Morton Feldman, and a lot of at the time Buffalo was a real. I think correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Morton Subotnick was there even for a while, and it was just Morton Feldman. I'm not sure, but she met those people, and she went to New York and met a lot of really great young musicians on the scene at the time. William Parker, who's probably one of the greatest free jazz bass players on the planet right now, and developed relationships with all these people, with George Lewis in Chicago. And she went back home with all that knowledge and experience. And she told me it's like when she met John Cage, she became very, very, very close friends. And she told me like after I met John and heard his music and talked to him, I realized that my 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 true goal in life was to just advance the cause of improvisation, not composition, improvisation. And we associate John Cage more on the compositional side of things, right? From our perspective in classical music. But what she got out of working with John was that improvisation was the way to go.
Hmm.
And she spent her whole career just basically improvising and meeting people and recording purely improvised music. And she's done a lot of compositions, and she composes a lot too now. But her main thing was improvisation.
Well, some people I think
So
feel that improv and composition are kind of tied together.
well, they are. They are. I mean, we're, semantics are a bit weird when you. But the further down you dig, the more you realize that they are the same. But from a traditional
Yeah.
viewpoint, they're considered very different, right? Anyway, so my meeting with Joel really influenced me a great deal. I realized that I had to really put a lot of energy into developing my own voice as an improviser and developing my technique so that I could really play in the moment and everything. Anyway, and Joel knew of this young pianist, Benoit Delbecq, who was doing some interesting things with prepared piano. And Benoit had an opportunity to go to the Banff Center in a jazz program in the summer of 1984. And that was a real sort of pivotal moment for him. He met a lot of great young musicians in the faculty then, Dave Holland and John Abercrombie and a number of other people. But he went back to France and really started working on his own compositions and his own way of approaching the piano. And Joelle heard him play in a concert, and he told her that he had been invited to the jazz festival. This is like at around 93, 94. And she told him, it was like, well, when you go to Vancouver, you have to meet and play with Francois. I think you guys will really hit it off. Nice guy, blah, blah, blah. So he came to Vancouver, and we met, and we talked, and I told him, it's like, well, we really have to do something together. Then the subsequent year, I was in Paris doing a bunch of concerts and touring with Joel, and I called Benoit up and I said, we should get together and do some playing. He says, yes, well, instead of coming to my place, let's go to the studio and we're going to record.
Oh, wow.
So, without really thinking much about it, we just went to the studio, brought a bunch of tunes that we were working on, recorded what turned out to be our first CD, Nankali. And then we've went on to record about 4 or 5 other CDs since as a duo. And we did also some recordings. We talked about doing recordings with other people to open it up and turn it into a trio eventually. So we recorded with a great British saxophone player, Evan Parker, 1 year in Montreal. And then I proposed to him. It's like, well, I know Joel. I've known Joel for like 20 plus years. I've known you for 20 plus years. Why don't we do a project together? And I called Joel. I pitched the idea to her, and she loved it because, ironically enough, we'd been working together as duos with Joel and Benoit with me for 20 plus years now. It's been like, we do the math. Since 1994, I started playing with Joel at 93, 94, and it's 2016. Mm-hmm. So 20 plus years for sure. But they had never played together, even though they both lived in Paris within less than a kilometers from each other. So I said, well, this is great that I bring in my 2 longest musical collaborators together to do a trio with. And we did this performance in Paris, which was recorded live, and it became the CD. So that's the story.
So wait, that's just for listeners. We're talking about the first record still, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
The Rue Paul Fort CD on Leo Records.
Interesting. So that was actually recorded live in Paris.
Yes. Yeah.
Great.
And that came out on Leo Records last year in the fall, and it's a beautiful document because it's improvised. But if you listen to some of the tracks, you can certainly hear some themes and some, it's very composed in a lot of ways. Some of it is more new music. Some of it sounds more like spectral music. Some of it sounds more like folk melodies, and some of it is almost like jazz, right? Mm-hmm. But it's its own music. It touches upon a lot of different aesthetic threads but it's its own trio music, basically. It's the sounds of our collective souls put together. Not to sound too flaky, but
Yeah.
um, and it's all my experience of playing the clarinet and playing with Benoit's prepared piano, and my experience of working with Joelle, who also sings when she plays the bass. So it's a very deep, moving document for me because it brings in this whole 20 plus years of musical relationships together in one place.
So with the next record, Double Entendre, it sounds. I really love how the sounds on there, the layered clarinet is working, and I like how you sort of played with the stereo field of the headphones. Do you
Hmm.
consider live performance? Do you consider recording an album to sort of transcend live performance, that you can use the studio in that way, or is it just something different?
Uh, well, by asking that question, it you know you can't help but to think about Glenn Gould, and his report to the audience and his report to the recording medium. And I've put a lot of thought into that, of course. I mean, there's some influential statements from one of our greatest musical exports. Um, but I don't think that you can ever recreate um, a live situation and you know in the recording medium. You can sort of imitate it and come pretty darn close to it, if you have a good technician and everything. But I don't really think about that much when I'm working uh, in the studio. However, for the context of Double Entendre, because Pierre Boulez's his composition, Dialogue de l'ombre double, which is on this CD, deals with this idea of spatialization in the score. First of all, for context, the piece is written for solo clarinet and and a double, which is a recorded clarinet. And each movement alternates between the live clarinet and the pre-recorded clarinet. And the live clarinet is always in the middle of the hall uh, and amplified and played through the loudspeakers in the hall. Okay.
Hmm.
Um,
We're talking about the
and
Boulez piece, correct?
yes, and the pre-recorded piece pans over nine speaker channels, which are set up around the audience in a circle. So it's just a circle and around sort of situation. And the live clarinet is processed through an acoustic piano, which is backstage. And the resonance of the piano is then fed back into the hall. So instead of using the reverb of the hall, he's actually using the reverberation of the clarinet playing through the piano, fed back into the PA system
That's
in the
so
hall.
cool.
It's pretty radical in a way. And he was really thinking at the time in the early 80s about how to change the audience's perception of where the sound's coming from, how to position the performers in the midst of the audience. He was considering all these things that are really a culmination of all the what the Fluxus movement was thinking about, what the modernists were thinking about, what Stockhausen was thinking about, having four symphony orchestras played live, with an audience sandwich in between the orchestras. So that piece is really about that. It's sort of like a Mount Everest of the clarinet repertoire as well, because it's technically challenging. It's an 18-minute piece of music, and it demands uh, every ounce of knowledge that you can have on the instrument and technical ability pushed to its limit. And that's probably why few people have attempted to record the piece, I think. Um,
Is
you
that what
know, there,
inspired you with your album Aerials to go in and record the clarinet with the piano resonance?
definitely, definitely. I thought that I had when you're playing live, playing with Benoit, for example, I would often put my clarinet bell right into the piano and he would press the sustain pedal. And with his piano preparations, we'd get all kinds of different harmonic clouds. So we were already doing that. And then I thought maybe when I do my solo album, I would like to take that idea and put that in. And then, of course, I discovered the boulez, and I thought, well, that it's part of my experience now as a performer and as an improviser. So why not do an album where that is an element of my solo language, so to speak.
Hmm.
So it's definitely informed by my work with Benoit, and also working on scores like Boulez. I mean, it's not exclusive to him to use the piano in that context, but I've certainly encouraged a number of collaborators and composers to consider those ideas, just to uh, because it helps to shape a sort of a harmonic, an overtone awareness of what the instrument sounds like. Because when you play the clarinet in a hall, you hear the sound of the clarinet, you know. But when you're playing with multiphonics, when you're playing with fast arpeggiated movements and everything like that, there's uh, an inward sense of harmony, or a built-in sense of harmonic construct that is proper to the instrument, proper to
Hmm.
the clarinet. That, we're used to hearing the clarinet as a monophonic instrument, but when you start working with it with multiphonics and more in a vertical kind of way, um, it's a very unique spectral language because of the odd partials of the instrument. When you listen to brass concerts, it's always the overtones are always basically a harmonic series, but the clarinet harmonic series, as most of your listeners will know, is different. So I started writing my music and conceiving of my improvisations much more based on the acoustical properties of the instrument, rather than playing with the traditional constructs of the jazz construct of the harmonic series, and all the harmonic extension is usually the flat nine, the ninth, the 13th, etc. Well, on the clarinet, it's different. It works with odd partials, third, fifth, seventh, ninth odd partials, and then microtonal qualities. So when you're working with the piano resonances and you're playing your clarinet and you do a multiphonic, the piano will pick up the idiosyncrasies and the spectral components of what the clarinet does. So it doesn't become dissonant. It only emphasizes the properties of the instrument. And that, as once I started thinking and listening really carefully to what it did, it opened up a whole new sort of way of approaching the instrument for me. So Ariels explores it's sort of like my baby steps into that world. So it's a very important document because it's a real paradigm shift in the way that I approach the instrument, basically.
We're going to do a complete 180 here. You kind of talked about playing some real serious works like Boulez and improvised solo works, but your versatility also extends to pop music. And I must admit, I feel almost bad bringing this up on a classical music podcast, but I just have to. I've been a huge fan of Matthew Good for a long time. And those who don't know, he's a Canadian songwriting, I would say one of the best songwriters of our time, but he's mostly well known in Canada. And he's no stranger really to using classical instruments. I mean, in 2003, he used the Vancouver Symphony on his album Avalanche quite extensively, actually. But in 2011, he released a new record called Lights of Endangered Species, and you actually were featured playing clarinet on a track on there. How did that end up happening?
Well, that was what you would call a gig. It's not to take away all the romantic aspect of it, but I was aware of his work, and I wasn't involved with the VSO performance of this, but I heard some of it on the radio, and I thought it was pretty cool. And he always gets a lot of ink whenever he plays in this part of the world. He's a fine artist, I think, and I don't know what he's up to now, but I never actually got to meet him, unfortunately, because we just did a session. I got the call for the session from a guy who does contracting of various sorts, and they said, we need a wind quintet for this piece, for this singer-songwriter. And I said, yeah, sure, okay, I'll do it. And I get to the studio, and I realize that it's Matthew Good. It's his music. And the arrangements were done by, it's a British producer, I think, that he hired for that project specifically. And this producer, I forget his name, it's probably on the sleeve, on the liner notes, was very, 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 very specific as to what he wanted, what the sound of the album was going to be like. And he wanted something that was fairly orchestral, but more in a chamber orchestra kind of way. So he did all the brass, all the strings, and all the winds sessions separately. So when I recorded it, we had a wind quintet, and we played to a track that had only guitar, bass, drums, and his voice, nothing else. And it was a bit of a challenge because we recorded at Fluvog Studio in Coquitlam, and in the dead of winter. It was a particularly cold year in January in Vancouver. Usually it's pretty balmy here compared to back east or Calgary, but it was a cold one. And the room we were in was freezing cold. It was like, you know, those rock guys, I don't know what they recorded, but they didn't seem to have any problems with it.
Yeah.
And of course, the bassoonist and the French horn player, the first thing they said is like, no, I'm not playing, you know, and I'm worried. And I was worried about my clarinet cracking and everything, you know, and my reeds were warping like crazy. And that was before I discovered Leger. Anyway, so it was an awful session because we had to do take after takes of all this really, really fine writing that was all in open fifth and fourth and you know, very, very nice open harmonies. But it was hell to play in tune. So we had to do a whole bunch of takes before we satisfied this guy who didn't understand why we were so out of tune. And he said, well, you know, I've recorded everywhere and it's never been a problem. And I was like, well, dude, you know, like, look at
It's freezing cold.
Look at the thermometer, you know, like there's your problem.
Turn up the heat.
Get some heaters in there and we'll give you a good take.
That's so weird. It's funny. I would have expected a different, to be honest, a different story. I would have thought that Matt would have wanted to be there and it would have kind of been a more of a collaborative effort, but just another gig, eh?
It was pretty much hands-on, hands-off as far as he was concerned. I mean, you know, in the pop world, when you're doing these big projects, and the reality is you need a good producer who will be able to get the kind of sound that will give you airtime. That's the main thing. You know, their concerns about the clarinetist's health and you know, comfort level in the studio is very, very low on the list of priorities.
Yeah, absolutely.
But, you know, what we could have done in a half hour ended up being an afternoon of hard work. So it was not a great experience in that way. But then when the CD came out, I was surprised, actually. I liked the sound of the project. I liked what he did with it. You'd be pretty hard pressed to hear me in there in the mix.
It's definitely a blend, yeah.
It's a blend of things, and I appreciated that. But I thought, you know, if you're going to use all these resources and call some of the best players in town or in the country to come and record on your album, you probably want to, you know, make full use of that and bring out some of those colors.
Yeah, are you familiar with the band Talk Talk?
Yeah.
Yeah, Talk Talk, their album Laughing Stock features a lot of different clarinet and different instruments. And I imagined in my head maybe because, you know, Matthew Good, actually, I don't know if you know this, but one of his biggest influences was Talk Talk and Mark Hollis. And specifically those two albums, Spirit of Eden and Laughing Stock. And on Laughing Stock, those recording sessions have become almost legendary because basically they would just record little snippets of different people expressing themselves musically, and they wouldn't allow any session musician to leave until they felt like they'd expressed themselves in some way. And so, but the recordings that came out of it are just really genuine, interesting, like phenomenal moments in there.
Very original stuff, I imagine.
Yeah, and even Radiohead, I mean, when they had Jimmy Hastings playing on the album Amnesiac, they even featured that live, and like Tom York introduced Jimmy Hastings to come out and play the track, and they had this gorgeous kind of New Orleans jazz solo to go with it. So Yeah, I guess it's just a little disappointing to hear that kind of went that way.
Yeah,
But a lot of
yeah.
pop recordings are made in that way, you know?
Yeah, and then others are done the right way. You know, if you listen to Sigur Rós,
Oh,
when
absolutely. They're
they
great.
recorded with the London Sinfonietta, it's beautiful. You know, it's really well done. You really hear the strings and the brass and everything, and it sounds fantastic. No, I mean, but my experience with this particular session was that it could have been done differently, but you have to defer to what the producer wants, and you really don't have a say in the matter of how even they're going to place a microphone on you, you know. And fortunately, I knew the people at Fluvog, and they know what they were doing. They did a really good job, you
Hmm.
know. But it's still fun, just you know, just to know that your name is attached to you know, to a successful performer like Matthew is not a bad thing. It always reflects well, you know.
Absolutely, yeah.
Unfortunately, I think classical players in general get a pretty raw deal when it comes to these sessions because they're either part of an orchestra or part of an ensemble, and it's the ensemble name that gets put there, but never the individuals who bring the music to life, you know.
Yeah.
And that's something that I've, as a freelancer, I decided whenever I sign a contract to do any of these sessions,
Oh, you should get the credit, yeah.
I want the credit. Just like if you're going to use if you're a photographer, you're going to use one of my photos, well, I'm going to give you credit for it, you know. So that's an important thing that we need to address whenever we're working as a freelancer, because it's also our meal ticket. People will see that I recorded with Matthew, then maybe another rock band will say, "Hey, we want some clarinet on this track." They'll call me, right?
Well, it's funny. I have to admit that when I was in high school, I was like, "Oh, if Matthew Good ever needs clarinet on a record, I dream he would one day use me." But I guess he
I
had
I
a
beat
different
you to
phone
it.
number.
Sorry about that, Sean.
It's all good, I
Next
suppose.
time he needs a clarinet player and they want to record in January in Calgary, I'll give him your name.
Perfect. So on the giveaway for today, you're sending me a couple CDs that you're gonna slap a signature on there, and one lucky winner will have a chance to win those. What would you like to say to the person who wins these?
um, Take the time to listen. Don't put them on when you're driving because you might end up in a collision somewhere. You know, do it at home safely with a good system and just sit back and take it all in. But you might have to do it on over several times because I think some of the music is I think it warrants that.
Absolutely. And so today we discussed mostly Francois' recording career and sort of his past. In a second episode, we're going to focus almost entirely on extended techniques and some different things you can do with that or where music is going with that. I'm sure we'll have a lengthy conversation about that as well. I'm going to put links to Francois' website and some other places online that are relevant that you can check out in the show notes. Francois, is there anything else you'd like to add to today?
I think it sounds good. I look forward to chatting some more. And if anybody has any questions, there's a contact sheet on my website. People can write to me and ask me more questions. And the website is a living document. It's always evolving. So there's a little blog there, but there's also a lot of things about the clarinet that I'm planning on parking there. So it's a work in progress.
Yeah, I'm also looking forward to asking you about your clarinet DNA project next time, which is
Aha. Yeah.
so we'll talk about that.
Okay, cool.
Great, thanks so much for coming on the show today, Francois.
Real pleasure, Sean.
Thanks for listening to the Clarinet podcast. If you'd like to learn more about today's episode, please see the show notes for episode 26 at www.clarineat.com. This episode was brought to you by D'Addario Woodwinds. Sanding, shaping, balancing. For centuries, mastering your instrument meant mastering these crafts too. But now, D'Addario is redefining craftsmanship for the 21st century by refining their reeds and mouthpieces with technology built from the ground up. By using the world's most innovative techniques to deliver consistently what was once made variable by hand, D'Addario ensures excellence right out of the box as standard, not a surprise. So you can spend less time sanding, shaping, and balancing, and more time perfecting your own craft. To learn more about the new era of craftsmanship from D'Addario Woodwinds, visit d'addario.com/woodwinds.